Well, the first thing they do is they appeal to morality and duty, because the provisional government is a government which is based around a belief in trust in their relationship with the population, and they believe that they are the people's government, that they are doing the best for their population. And so they write appeals to the peasants and they say, please, sow more land, give your grain up, be good citizens. This is for the good of the revolution and for the good of Russia and for the good of the war effort. This is the first thing they try and do. They appeal to the better interests of the population. Unfortunately, this doesn't work very well, which is difficult for the provisional government because they don't actually have much behind them other than appeals. They are unwilling and indeed refuse pretty much to use force against the population, because the next step, if the population are unwilling to release their grain to the state as a result of these appeals, then they've got to say, well, we'll send in soldiers and we will take this grain from you. The provisional government was never willing to do that because the provisional government was a nice government. They were a gentle government. They wanted to work with their population. They believed in themselves. And, you know, this really does produce a big problem for the provisional government. It has this real issue with food supply and it can't do anything concrete about it other than just ask. So that's the first thing it does. It establishes a grain monopoly, which basically says that all surpluses produced in the country are to be the property of the state, that the state will buy them at fixed prices, which in principle is a good idea. It's the only way of trying to control this problem, you would argue. They also set up local food committees, and these local food committees will try to administer these systems. I mean, another issue we've got is that the administration of Russia's countryside has collapsed, because when the Tsar abdicated, nothing just sprang up in its place to replace all the old systems of control and administration in the countryside. So the provisional government tried to set up their own systems. However, their systems had a fatal flaw, and it was a fatal flaw that they couldn't avoid, and that was that they believed in democratisation. By democratisation, I mean that they believed that everything should be based on being elected from the grassroots. So the food committees that were set up in the villages and in the regional towns and in the regional capitals were elected by the local populations. Now, when it comes to food committees at village level, so at the lowest level, you've got groups of peasants who are going to get together and they're going to pick their men who are going to be on their food committee. And this food committee is going to be representative to the centre. However, their men are not necessarily going to be very interested in what the centre wants from them. They're going to be much more interested in presenting the needs and demands of their friends, their community. And so what we get actually is extremely rebellious and naughty food committees who do exactly what they want. So they continue to represent the interests of the people who elected them, but not necessarily represent the interests of the state, which is, you know, what the provisional government were hoping would happen. So in fact, the local administration that develops in 1917 actually perpetuates a loss of control from the centre, that the centre is not able to administer the regions effectively because it allows the regions to govern themselves. It's a big problem then for the provisional government. They establish rationing in towns, which is an obvious sort of a thing to do. What more could they do? They've tried, they've asked everyone to behave, they've asked everyone to pull together for the good of the state and for the good of the revolution. They've tried to establish, you know, means of improved communication and improved administration. What else could they do? Well, the one thing that was called from them a lot was a demand to control all trade. That is, that the state should have a complete monopoly, not just on grain, but on everything, in order to make it fair, to bring the costs of other goods down for the rural population so they would be more willing to exchange their goods. That's all very well in principle, but in practice, this involved a massive enterprise. To have an entirely state-controlled economy is beyond the vision of the provisional government, and I think is actually in practice not really, it wouldn't have worked. They couldn't have done it. They have these failings of transportation and coordination, which had dogged the old Tsarist government, and it continued to be a problem for the provisional government. In fact, the problem got worse because transportation got more difficult as, you know, the chaos of revolution, of the movement of the population, meant that the transport system was bowing down with the pressure of bodies and goods that were being moved in 1917. And then the final option, I would say, in terms of solutions for the bread problem, would be military force. The provisional government, A, isn't willing to use military force, but B, who is going to be that soldier who's willing to use force against the rural population? Because the soldiers are revolutionised, the soldiers are for the people. You actually can't ask an army, you can't ask a regional militia to use force against a rural population because they're not going to do it. And we're going back now to power and authority. Where's the power? They don't have the power, they don't have the untrammelled authority that is required to really dominate an issue. So there's the bread problem then. Provisional government doesn't have a lot of success, but they do try. What do the Bolsheviks? The Bolsheviks promise bread. They promise that they're going to solve this problem. They're going to sort it out. And the general accusation actually is that it's incompetence and lack of care from the provisional government's administrators that has led to this problem. So what do the Bolsheviks do? Well, what the Bolsheviks do is actually really remarkably little. They don't have any answers to these very complex and deep-rooted problems. And what they're led to do is to use punitive measures in the countryside. And the Bolsheviks have got the confidence to do this where the provisional government did not. They send in troops, they send in soldiers who will requisition from the countryside. And you can argue that the bread problem and the Bolsheviks' attempts to solve it are really the start of the civil war in Russia. And you can frame it as a civil war between town and country, as well as a civil war between various different political forces. So there's bread. So we've got lots of problems, provisional government no answers, Bolsheviks no answers either, really, nothing clear. So what's the problem with the land question then? This is another one of the Bolsheviks' big rallying cries, land, all the land to all the people without any compensation. So this idea comes from the fact that many peasants in Russia tended to believe that their problems in terms of the amount of land that they have available and level of poverty that they suffered could be alleviated if they could have access to the land that was held in private hands by landlords. And so in 1917 we see that the rural population starts to take control, to take authority into its own hands, and increasingly we see the seizure of private land, whether it be woodland or arable or pastures, that they are seized by the peasant communities and used for their own interests. This is a problem which I have to add is unfortunately very complex because it's regionally defined. I mean, Russia, as I've already said, is this vast empire. Different parts of Russia had very different geographical conditions, very different land holding and very different problems. In some areas, there was almost no arable land. So, for example, the province of Vyatka had almost no arable land. It wasn't that kind of that kind of geography. They had a lot of forestry. So in Vyatka, they also didn't have much of a tradition of private landholding. So there wasn't much conflict between peasants and landlords. However, in other areas, particularly in the Black Earth regions, in the centre of European Russia, there was a lot of conflict between landlords, the big private estates, and the peasants. And these are probably almost the cliches of peasant activism in 1917. They come from the Black Earth regions. So we see seizure of land, seizure of wood, and the destruction sometimes of landlord estates. And the peasants, they often seek validation for their actions. They want to have written information to say, we did this in the interests of the state, that we did this with the support of the state. And there's a real sense of crisis developing in 1917 for the government in terms of the way the countryside is going. They're getting very, very anxious because they seem to be losing control of the countryside. They've clearly been losing control of the countryside in terms of the bread problem, but they also lose control in terms of the land problem. The provisional government's solutions for the land problem are not so dissimilar from what they do with grain. And that is, first, they try to establish local land committees, and these committees are locally elected, and they are to help control and contain the way in which land is utilised prior to a final decision of the land question by the Constituent Assembly. As far as the provisional government is concerned, it cannot simply make a decision about redistribution of land because it does not have the legal authority. It is only a temporary government. So the provisional government believed it had to wait for the establishment of the Constituent Assembly before any final decision could be made on the land problem. Well, that's all very well, but unfortunately this doesn't answer immediate peasant demands, and it doesn't give them immediate popularity. They probably could have got a very good measure of immediate popularity just by saying, okay, all land to be transferred to the regional land committees. But they weren't willing, they weren't bold enough to do that. The Bolsheviks were bold enough to do it, and the Bolsheviks actually adopted the slogan, the policy which had been put together by the Socialist Revolutionary Party, by a competing party of the Bolsheviks. They adopted it in full in November of 1917, and they just said, yeah, all land is transferred into the hands of the peasants, which is popular. It gives them a bit of support. It actually wasn't so dramatic because by November of 1917, in many areas, peasants had already appropriated control of the landlord's estates. It really legitimised what had already happened. But still, it shows a difference, I suppose, between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks, that the Bolsheviks were willing to take that bold step to break with tradition. It wasn't a good way of solving the land problem because the land problem needed a much slower, more considered approach, which is what the provisional government were interested in. But it did give them a measure of immediate popularity, and we can argue then that the provisional government, had it been politically careless, but in the interests of its popular support, just said, okay, all land to the peasants, that might have helped buoy them up politically and give them some more support. So that's the land question. Now, I've left I think the most difficult one to last, and that's peace. So the Bolsheviks promised peace. Peace at what price? What about the provisional government? So the provisional government who came to power in 1917, they came to power in a very bad position in the midst of a massive, massive war, the First World War. Russia had been embroiled in this war for 3 years already, had lost many, many lives. I mean, I think we're talking about 7 million were lost, either dead or wounded or taken prisoner in the course of 14 to 17. What's the provisional government to do? Well, some historians have said, or some commentators have said, well, they should have withdrawn from the war. But I would challenge that. I'm not sure how the provisional government could have withdrawn from the war. They had all the treaties in place with the Allies for a start, but that's maybe less important. The reality is, I mean, Russia's population were not dead set against the war at the beginning of 1917. They'd already poured massive resources, human resources, into this war, and it was unquestionable and unthinkable to sign a separate peace with Germany. Also, to sign a separate peace with Germany would mean for Russia the loss of vast territory. So the provisional government was in a position where she may not have liked the war, but she was unable to withdraw from the war. So really, the continuation of the war was a rock around the neck of the provisional government, but I don't think they had any alternatives. When we see what the Bolsheviks did, the Bolsheviks promised peace, and to some extent they give us it. So we have a peace decree on the 27th of October 1917, which is just after the Bolsheviks seized power. And this calls for an immediate armistice. But then the Bolshevik government have the same problem as the provisional government, which is, how do we sign a separate peace? How do you do it? And they have toing and froing. We have Trotsky talking about neither war nor peace, which is this rather meaningless slogan which he pushed around. Finally, the Bolsheviks are pushed into signing something because the Germans start to advance. The Russian fronts have collapsed. Russia is no longer being adequately defended, and so the Germans take advantage of this and they start to push forward. They start to push forward very close to Petrograd. Indeed, in end of 1917, early 1918, there's panic in Petrograd, a sense that the Germans are coming, that the great imperial capital is going to be taken by foreign hand. So the Bolsheviks then are forced into the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which is the 3rd of March in 1918. Now, this treaty tells you what the provisional government would have had to do in order to sign a separate peace with the Germans. They surrendered 60 million people, a huge part of their population. They surrender the Baltic lands, Ukraine, Belarusia, vast swathes of Western Russia go over to the Germans. I mean, these are unthinkable sacrifices for Russia in normal times. And Lenin recognises that he has to sign this peace because they can't continue to fight the war, because the soldiers are no longer an active army. But I think it really shows us that the provisional government in more normal circumstances in 1917 couldn't possibly have signed Brest-Litovsk. I mean, the Bolsheviks themselves, even Lenin, they were torn apart by this treaty, and Lenin nearly lost control of the party as a result of the Brest-Litovsk treaty. I mean, a final point really for the Bolsheviks and peace. So they get us out of the war, but finally the Bolsheviks initiate Russia's civil war, which is a massive war, which kills more people than the First World War, which is dragging on into 1921. So I think the promise of peace is a sleight of hand from the Bolsheviks in 1917, and it does not come to pass. So very briefly, I'm just going to sum up and give you a couple of conclusions. I think that the reason that there were two revolutions in 1917, that is that the provisional government was overwhelmed by the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, the reasons for this lie more with the impossibility of the tasks that the provisional government faced and less with their personal failings. I think that's a little bit different from some of the approaches you'll get in some of the recent historical writing. The provisional government had to democratise Russia. It had to allow Russia to elect their own representatives, because that was the mood of the day. That was what was required. But by allowing Russia to democratise, the provisional government lost control of its administrative network, and it wasn't able to hang on to Russia's vast administrative power. So the country starts really to govern itself in a sense. It starts to break apart, and I think this breaking apart actually continues in the Bolshevik period in the Civil War years, as we see really a fragmentation of the Russian Empire. And finally, I would argue that the Bolsheviks, with bread, land and peace, they can't offer any real solutions. These are only promises, not answers.